One of the things I found, Cameron, is that if young people don't ever experience lack, like the absence of money, they'll think that it's just free flowing and ever present, right? And that generally is what happens when parents who want to give their kids everything they didn't have growing up.
Of course.
And the kid goes, "Can I have it? Please, please, please." The parents are like, "Of course you can." And it begins to set a precedent for that kid later on in their life.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Invest Paul podcast. I'm pleased to welcome Adam Carroll to the podcast today. Adam has gone viral for his TED Talk around financial abstraction titled "What Playing Monopoly with Real Money Taught Me About My Kids and Humanity." He's focused in on helping people around financial literacy, growing their retirement savings, and paying off their debt sooner. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Cameron. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, likewise. So I think, maybe to kick things off, it's a very interesting TED Talk. For some background, you gave your kids $10,000 of real money to play with and compared that against, what happened when it was fake money and how they ended up adjusting their life cycle. So I'm curious to dive in a little bit about what you found behind that and how it can be applied to the wider world.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love this topic, obviously. I did not, when I initially played the game with my kids and then I wrote the TED Talk and did the TED Talk, I never once dreamed that there would be 6 million views plus, of me doing that with my children. But candidly, excuse me, where it came from, Cameron, was I had been traveling to colleges and universities all across the country and had been delivering a message of financial literacy to them. And I was asking students from all over the U.S., especially, how much will you have in student loan debt when you graduate? And guess what the number one answer was?
I don't know.
Yeah, they'd say, "I don't know. I have no clue."
Yeah.
And I'm like, ballpark best guess. And they just like shrug their shoulders. I don't know, 60, 80, 100. I have no idea. And for me, it was like, how do you not know this? Partially because I graduated a debt statistic myself from university, and I had $30,000 in student loans and I had $8,000 in credit card debt. But I learned the lesson, got out of debt really quickly right after I graduated. And then I wanted to share that with other people. And so I'm watching my kids play Monopoly one day, and I was like, "What are you guys doing?" They were buying each other out of jail, like giving $200 to the banker to get their sibling out of jail. And I
That's
said,
the real
"Hey,"
world, though, right?
I suppose, yeah, it's like bail bondsman. I said, "Hey, I really appreciate how nice you're being," because they were loaning each other money to buy properties. But I said, candidly, this is not the way the game is played.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I was like trying to equate, are they doing that because the money isn't real? They just want to roll the dice and move the pieces. And then it was like, well, that's what students are living in, is they're living in this surreal world where money isn't real. They can exist for 4 or 6 or 8 years and never make a payment on the debt that they're taking out. And that feels pretty surreal and or very abstract, as I put it in the TED Talk. And I was like, what if the money were real? Would they play differently? And so lo and behold, I went to my credit union on a Friday and I pulled out $9,990 in cash and all the denominations of bills. And under 10 grand prevents you from having to file all the IRS paperwork in the States.
Right.
And so, they're all thanking me but then like huddled around the window going, what are you going to do with this money? So it was an awesome experience, and it really did change the way my kids played and change the way we raised them around money fundamentally.
So on that note, everyone uses, like I use Apple Pay exclusively now. I barely even take out my wallet,
Yeah.
let alone have cash in my wallet.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a natural drift away now on the tangibility of money and how we think about it?
I do. And so let me ask you, when you use Apple Pay, are you using your phone or your watch, or how do you pay?
Yeah, my phone.
Your phone. So, I mean, interestingly, when I first started thinking about this topic as well, and I had gotten Apple Pay and I was using it for the first or second time, and it was like a marvel to me that you could do this, And I remember I was at a grocery store and I bought groceries with my phone using Apple Pay. And my son, my 8-year-old son standing next to me said, I can't wait till I get a phone so I can buy stuff. And I was like, oh, that is not the message. That is not the message I want. So I do think it's changing. I think people are getting more and more abstract with money because whether it's Venmo or PayPal or Apple Pay, Google Pay, by the time money goes into Venmo, it doesn't exist anymore. And
Right.
there's like lots of narrative about this online that people go, oh, whatever's in my Venmo account is just fun money. I don't even care how much is in there. Well, it might as well be beans or beads or chickens, once you put it in there, if you're not paying attention to it. And so one of the messages I started delivering on college campuses was every time you have money in your Venmo account, sweep it back out to your checking account so you know how much it is. Because there were students who I'd ask, how many of you have no idea how much is in your Venmo account? 80% of them would raise their hand.
Huh. Very interesting. So I know you raise a point in that podcast as well around like a duty parents have to educate their children earlier on in life. And you bring up a good point around like leadership within that as well. Is there, for any parents listening to this right now, is there any quick advice that you'd recommend towards them on helping them educate their kids around money earlier on?
Yeah, there were so many lessons that came out of the Monopoly game and our debrief afterwards. But right off the bat, what I would say is that this came from like a longitudinal study around leaders, and particularly young leaders who had risen in the ranks of their companies or their career early. Excuse me. And what they found out was that they were generally thrust into a decision-making situation early on. And then with great coaching and guidance and mentorship, they made excellent decisions. And then from that coaching and guidance, they kept making good decisions. And I extrapolated that around money and said, listen, the problem with most of these college students that I'm meeting that are 18 to 24, let's say, is that they've not been making their own financial decisions. Their parents are still making them.
Right.
If I said to the kids, these 18-year-olds are adults legally, I would say, well, how about credit card? Tell me about credit. Well, it's my parents' card and I just swipe their card and they pay for it. Or I'd say, well, how much does it cost to get X? And they'd go, I have no idea. My parents take care of that. And for me, what I heard in that story over and over and over again was the parents, in their nature of trying to protect their kids, and I've asked parents this before, why do you put money in your kids' account? Well, I don't want my kids to struggle. I love my kids, and I think we have, by and large, conflated love and struggle. I love my kids, but I want them to struggle because struggle creates who they're going to be later on in life.
Absolutely.
And so for parents today, what I would say is, if you have younger kids, especially, start putting money in their hands in the way of allowance or, call it commission for chores done or whatever you want to call it. Put money in their hands that you would normally spend on them anyway at Target or the grocery store or at, a toy store or ice cream or donuts or whatever you're buying for them. When you put money in their hand, then let them know, hey, we're hitting the reset button. This is now on you. You get to decide. You're going to pay with your money. Because one of the things I found, Cameron, is that if young people don't ever experience lack, like the absence of money, they'll think that it's just free flowing and ever present, right? And that generally is what happens when parents who want to give their kids everything they didn't have growing up.
Of course.
And the kid goes, can I have it? Please, please, please. And parents are like, of course you can. And it begins to set a precedent for that kid later on in their life.
That's very interesting. I mean, I guess to counter your point before, money has been pretty free flowing the past couple of years, but now there's that reckoning where, higher inflation means you can't pay your bills as much and you really need to take control of those finances ever more than you ever had before.
Totally. And to that end, the USDA has said that it's going to cost upwards of $385,000 to raise a child from 0 to 18. And I know parents that probably spend way more than that raising their kid from 0 to 18. And they, what they're doing quite often is they are not putting money away in savings and investments for themselves for the future. as a result of how much they're spending on their children. And I'm
Right.
not saying take away, necessarily from the kids, but be mindful about how much is actually going towards, towards investing and towards your financial future. And I think there's not enough focus on that.
So I think that's probably a good natural pivot, because I know you're also focused in on helping individuals save for retirement, plan for retirement, and pay off their mortgages.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the shred method?
Yeah, I'd love to. This There was this realization I had years ago, Cameron, that, and I was in the mortgage business in the nature of full disclosure. But what I found was that I would do a lot of refinances for people, and they would come back time and again every 2 years, right? And sometimes it was about a lower interest rate, and sometimes it was they had a little bit more debt. They wanted to consolidate into a mortgage. And one of our common one of the common happenings as we went through the loan closing process is you would show a TIL, a truth in lending disclosure. And the TIL basically says, here's how much you borrowed. Here's how much it's going to cost you in interest. Here's your total amount that you'll spend on this over the course of 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we would always say, hey, just sign this. This is the government's way of making you depressed. And we'd laugh it off as a joke. But the reality is that when you start to investigate an amortization table and how mortgages are paid, the majority of the interest is paid when?
At the front.
Yeah, at the front in the first 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
And do you know offhand how long most people stay in their home?
Oof. 7 years?
Yeah, you're almost spot on. It's like between 6.5 and 7 years is how long they stay. So if someone has stayed with the same mortgage for the 7 years they're in that home, and they have not made an extra payment or sent in additional principal, then essentially they're in red light territory. And the reason I say that, if you were to look at a mortgage and you set a traffic signal over the top of it, the first 10 years are red light, the second 10 years are yellow, and the last 10 years are green.
Yeah.
And most of us, we pay on our mortgage dutifully. And in Canada, it's a little bit different story because, what might often happen is your interest rate changes, but your payment doesn't. And so it's kicking the amortization table out even farther.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of Canadians who are probably caught up in that, where it's like, geez, I'm in a negative amortizing loan now, where it's just adding more and more time to this thing. Well, the shred method was it's basically a process that I learned about 12 years ago. And we started really marketing and promoting it about 3 or 4 years ago. But what I realized was that you can actually sort of play the bank's game against the bank and begin to game the amortization table, where you can speed up the process of paying off that mortgage and eliminate, in many cases, tens of thousands, and in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest, because I can show most people how to be completely mortgage free in somewhere between 3 and 7 years, depending on their discretionary income. And what it does is it creates this massive amount of freedom and flexibility in their life, which I think ultimately people are after. They want a big shiny pile of money, but what they really want is freedom and flexibility, in my opinion.
Or so the ability to quit your job without thinking twice.
Yep.
So could we double click a little bit about
Totally
what the shred method is all about, like what the process is behind it?
Yeah. The theory behind it, or it's not even a theory. What the way that it works is it takes advantage of the fact that most people's income is very inefficient. So the way I like to describe this is, I'm going to assume that when you get paid, money goes into a checking account. Is that a fair assumption?
Correct.
Yep. And I assume you use a debit card or you're doing automatic payment transactions from your bank. Is that fair?
Pretty much all goes on credit cards, and then I pay off my credit cards for the point.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I would say to you, you're already kind of prepared to use the shred method anyway. So you're creating some efficiency by putting everything on a credit card and then paying off the credit card, right? But what the shred method has you do is your income, instead of going into checking, which can be very efficient. And let me finish the story, that what we like to tell people is that if you were to leave your home in the morning to go to the grocery store, come back home knowing you had to go to the post office later on in the day, like 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, would you leave your car idling in the driveway all day?
Of course not.
Why not?
Because it's not efficient.
Yeah, not efficient, burns gas, hard on the environment, hard on your car. And yet, what we'll do with our paychecks is it goes into checking and then it sits there for days or weeks or months on end, depending on how much somebody has. And we've gotten to this point where we like to see a high balance in our checking account because it makes us feel good. It's like, oh, I'm solid. I've got 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 extra dollars sitting in there. But our mentality at Shred is that lazy, idle money is dangerous money. Because that's what has me going into Costco and walking out with a kayak that I don't need. It's like I had 400 extra dollars. What the heck? Look cool. Or a giant bounce house for my kids. That came home with us once, and my wife's like, "What the heck are we gonna do with this thing?" Like, I don't know. It's $200. I thought it was a good deal. And so the money is inefficient when it just sits there, especially when we're paying amortized interest on a high balance debt like a mortgage or a student loan or a commercial loan, SBA loan for a small business, could be any kind of loan like that. So what we do with Shred is the money, instead of going into checking, it cycles through what we call a Shred account. And a Shred account basically gives you a little bit of leverage, a little bit of liquidity. So we might call it a line of credit, home equity line of credit, personal line of credit, business line of credit. But we call it a Shred account because the money is cycling through there every 2 weeks or every month as you're paid. And our system, which is it's a software that's based on an algorithm, is looking at how much is coming in, how much is going out, how much are your debts, and where can the money be used most efficiently to eradicate debts and eradicate your monthly payments. And our whole goal is to minimize the amount of interest we pay and maximize the amount of discretionary income that you have available to you every single month.
So you're funding your HELOC, which you could then pay off other debts with or pay for your lifestyle.
That's exactly right. And if you're tracking with your methodology of putting everything on a credit card, quite often most credit cards also have a float period. So you have this 10 or 15-day period after the bill comes due that you can still pay it and not be charged interest.
Right.
So we can plug a grace period into the system and then take advantage even more of the fact that you're using money you've really already spent, but you're not going to pay any interest on. And then when it does come time to pay it off, we're just going to stroke a check out of the Shred account anyway. So that in itself is going to be leveraged. But because your income's coming in, in the next several days, we may only be borrowing it for a few days. And so the interest on it is negligible. I mean, we're talking dollars every month.
But could you walk us through like an example of that? Because in my mind, if you're walking it through, like let's say I get a $3,000 paycheck, I put that into my Shred account. I
Yep.
then might have like $6,000 available to like maybe fund an investment or to like pay for something.
Yep.
I still have to pay back $6,000 now next month.
Yeah. So, and you're using lump sum like 6 grand, where the system might say, if you're making 3 grand a month and it's 1,500 and 1,500, if you're paid every 2 weeks, the system might say, it looks like you have $1,500 coming in and you don't have a lot of expenses coming out in the next 2 weeks. Maybe it's just the time of the month where you're only paying, you're paying for groceries and that, but not necessarily a car payment or a house payment. So it would say you have this coming in, but we have to make room for it on the line of credit because the line of credit can only ever be zero or negative. It will never have a surplus in it, right?
Right.
So it would say to make room for that, you have 1,500 coming in. You have some expenses also, but let's send $1,787.25. And they're specific numbers that come out. But we're going to send that from the Shred account to your mortgage or whatever interest-bearing account we're paying off first. So send this amount there. And then 2 days later, 1,500 drops in because of your paycheck. So we borrowed 1,787 or whatever the number I said, minus 1,500. Now we're 287 borrowed on that line of credit. And we buy groceries and we do things, and maybe it gets up to $500 or $600, on our credit card. And so when it comes time to make that payment, the system will say, based on your inputs, it looks like you have this bill to pay. So pay your bill. You're going to have some surplus, but pay your mortgage potentially if you have your monthly mortgage payment to make. And maybe now the balance between all of those things, the balance is more like $1,700 or $1,800. And the system knows you have $1,500 coming in, but it's also going to leverage a little bit on that line of credit. So it says, okay, this time your lump sum payment is $317, right? And so that is sent. So in some cases, we may do a big lump sum, but candidly, Cameron, when interest rates were really low on lines of credit,
Yeah.
you'd see these large swaths of money going out because it didn't cost a lot to borrow that money for a short period of time. And now that HELOC and PLOC and BLOC rates are up to 8.5%, 7.5%, 8.5%, 9%, the system kind of ratchets back how much the lump sum payments are, still makes them, still accelerates the amortization payoff, but it just doesn't do it as aggressively.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of different ways you could deploy the capital. I have a lot of friends who would use it to invest. So they'd use their HELOC to invest.
Yep.
That dividend yield or the income from the investments would pay for the interest payments plus some of the principal as well.
Yep.
Do you push people towards that? Or are you seeing in a high interest rate environment that it's more geared towards like paying off your high interest bearing accounts first?
It's very personal, right? I mean, that decision is almost based on someone's risk profile and how well they enjoy or love their job, how long they plan on staying in it. A lot of the shredders that come to us, they'll say, I just don't want to have to work this hard this long, right? Because if you consider most people who are running towards retirement age, it's not like their bills are going down. Most of the time, it feels like their expenses are going to stay consistent, or they might even go up a little bit.
Right.
My parents retired about 5 years ago, and my dad said, that whole idea that you don't spend as much in retirement is BS. You spend more because you want to eat out or go out with friends or travel or do whatever. And if you have a mortgage that you're still paying to boot and car payments and all of that, it's just like, well, you have to continue to make more and more and more. But with Shred, what happens is your expenses actually become less and less and less and less because you're paying off your car. You have no credit card payments that you're making. If you're making a mortgage payment, as an example, one of the things that we'll tell people is, hey, you might not want to escrow. Don't escrow your taxes and insurance, and instead just pay those separately, because now you have a little bit more discretionary income every month. And by the time you're ready to pay it, it's going to come out of your line of credit anyway. So the liquidity is there. That's what most people are somewhat concerned about when we escrow in the first place. For the folks that say, I could make more money in the market, what I usually tell them is, you're right, you probably can. If you're a savvy investor, by all means, go do that. The challenge that I think we're facing right now is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you would know better than I, but I think we're going to have a very sideways market for a period of time. And unless you're trading options or you're buying dividend paying stocks, right, or doing something that's a REIT or something that's creating quarterly revenue, it feels like things are going to go sideways for a bit.
Even so, though, you could look at like a covered call ETF, and
Right.
that actually performs the best in a sideways market, and it's writing call options on a portion of the portfolio, which on the dividend yield behind some of those guys is like 13-ish%.
Yeah.
So like those aren't bad strategies in terms of like capital appreciation, though. Like, of course, you might not be growing your portfolio, but at least you're generating a decent amount of income off of it.
Totally. And I think there's a big distinction between, this is a Robert Kiyosakiism, but there's a difference between cash flow investors and net worth investors. And I think that there's a lot of people out there, I would be curious your take on this, a lot of consumers, investors who are putting money in that don't really know if they're a net worth investor or a cash flow investor.
So that's an interesting point. We actually surveyed a bunch of young people around their investing. So it's like, do you invest? Question series behind that, or don't you invest? Why not? And of the investors or the prospective investors, the largest driver for them, these are all people Gen Z in college or like just graduated. The largest driver for them was to generate income, which I thought was pretty backwards, because when you're young, you're just graduating school, you don't have enough in your portfolio to
Totally.
generate any income off of. So you should be focused in on net worth. And to your point, I don't think a lot of people actually know based off of their age what they should be focusing in on.
Yes. It's so interesting. I may even take that tidbit and go share it in some of my messaging because I think what you just articulated, Cameron, is one of the things that makes Shred so attractive to people is they really want to be investing at a 50 or $100,000 clip at a time.
Right.
Because I think you'd agree that when you invest 50 or 100 grand at a time, it changes the nature of the investment you're going into, right?
Well, you
I
can
mean,
even rationalize it. Like if I should be doing a dollar cost averaging. Like I should throw $100 a month in, but it's like maybe this month I'll go eat out in a nicer restaurant, and I won't put that hundred
yeah,
dollars in. But that $100 today ends up being like $1,000 X amount of years from now, and you're
totally,
really screwing yourself by not committing to that regular schedule and thinking of
totally.
it more in those massive tranches of investment.
Yep. And when you look at that logic of 100 today is 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000, in the future, when we look at mortgages for people and say, okay, you owe $700,000 on your mortgage, and right now you're sending $44,000 a year in interest to the banker. Does that make sense? And, we often will say people don't have an income problem, they have a liquidity problem.
Right.
And the liquidity is part of the reason they don't have liquidity is, they're burning tens of thousands of dollars in interest, sending a mortgage payment in every single month. And I don't fault anybody for it or vilify banks because it's a good business model. And we wouldn't have the kinds of things we have, cars and homes, if we didn't have that debt structure. However, one of our adages is if you do for 2 years what most people won't do, you can do for the rest of your life what most people can't do.
Yep.
So imagine if in 2 years you created a liquidity pool in the equity in your home. So blasted away a ton of mortgage debt, created this equity in your home that you have access to. And now when there is a $5,000 or $10,000 stock investment that you want to make or ETF fund that looks good, you could do that. You have that liquidity to participate in that. And the disclaimer here is it requires discipline. This is not for people who have more month at the end of their money. It doesn't work if you're overspending. But if somebody's very disciplined about their financial habits, which I assume your listeners are, this can make a ton of sense for someone. And even doing for 12, 18, 24 months, it's kind of life-changing.
Right. So I guess, a couple minutes left here. Maybe if we focus on a different subject a little bit. You mentioned it earlier on borrowing from your future self, essentially, which is, I
Yes.
think, what your infinite wealth product line is all about. It's whole life insurance, right?
Yeah. It's an infinite banking process, and essentially you overfund cash value whole life insurance with the intent of just creating a bank for yourself that you can borrow from and repay back as you see fit. There's a lot of advantages to it. It's got, the flexibility and the borrowability of it is really, really profound. So as an example, Cameron, if someone has a $25,000 a year premium, as an example, and generally when these are set up, you're limiting the amount of insurance that you're buying. So the death benefit might be a little bit lower. But you're putting 25 grand in to increase the cash value in that policy. And over the course of 4 years, let's say, the 100 grand that you've put in is sitting there in cash ready for you to use. You can borrow it. You can use it to pay for vacations or cars or down payment on an 8-plex. It doesn't matter what you use it for. And the beautiful part of it is when you borrow it out, you get to decide when, how, and if it's paid back. So you can decide, I'm not going to pay this but once a year or every quarter. You could say, I'm not going to make the payment this year, I'll make it next year. And
Right.
getting to decide that creates a lot of flexibility. The how it's paid back is it could be in a lump sum, it could be monthly, it's totally up to you. And then if it's paid back, there are people who will borrow money out of these policies and then just continually pay premiums and interest and be like, I don't really care. I've got a death benefit sitting there waiting for me. It's growing in cash value. I'm going to let it ride for a period of time.
Is there,
Yeah,
so, in, as it's been explained to me before, obviously the whole life differs than traditional life insurance because it doesn't end when when you stop paying your premiums, but
that's
it
right.
also does require, correct me if I'm wrong, but quite a high principal balance out the get go. Is there a typical net worth profile on someone who this fits more within? Because to the point you just mentioned, if it's like a $25,000 a year premium, you're
Yeah.
obviously skewing pretty high net worth behind that.
Yeah.
How does it differ? Like let's say I'm 25 years old, a couple years out of school. What does that look like for me?
Man, this is a great question. Because in the past, it was very much a high net worth or high income situation. You'd have doctors, lawyers, um, anyone who was making high six figures, 200,000 plus, I would say, someone who's an accredited investor, this is a very kind of natural thing that they're probably going to float to at some point is creating infinite banking policies. However, one of the things we wanted to do with Shred was we wanted to skew the ability to do infinite banking to everyone. And again, I go back to that idea that most people don't have an income problem, they have a liquidity problem.
Hmm.
So if I were to say to any of my family members, who are kind of W-2 working class, right? I said, hey, it's 25 grand a year premium. They go, well, where the heck am I going to get 25 grand from? And yet when you shred and you start shredding and you realize, well, I've been sending 20 grand a year to the bank in interest expense every year just on my mortgage. So if you start clawing that back and the money that had been going to interest is now being built up in equity in your property, dropping 25 grand once a year from a HELOC into an infinite banking policy becomes relatively simple. And I say 25, it could be 10, it could be 8, 6, 4. I mean, it doesn't matter how much it is. You get to decide how much that amount is. Um, but we're trying to skew it, to be more advantageous and available to everyone as opposed to just the upper income echelon. That being said, one of the things we ask Cameron right off the bat is, what will you use this for? Is this to buy a property? Is it a vacation fund? Is it, if you're buying a car every 3 or 4 years, maybe this is just your car fund that you're going to buy a car and then you're going to pay yourself back with interest, just like you would a bank. And that's a way to begin creating massive wealth using these tools. So it's not for everyone. I mean, I'll say that right off the bat, it's not for everyone. Um, but when people get it, it's kind of like showing the caveman fire.
Of course.
You're
Yeah.
like, why didn't anyone show me this before?
Yeah. So if I could put words in your mouth, you're essentially off this method, marrying the two together. You might be funding your whole life policy, your infinite banking policy, with your HELOC, your Shred account early on, so that in the future you're able to draw down from that policy and have extra income available to
That's exactly right. And it's really interesting when you string all these together so quickly. I know we're running out of time, but if someone starts with Shred and let's say they do 12 months, 18 months, 24 months with the Shred method, and they decrease the principal loan balance of their mortgage, they increase their equity, they have a line of credit. The next step, which is usually around the 24-month mark, 18 to 24 months, we go, hey, you may want to consider infinite banking. And let's go modest. Let's put 10 or 15 grand a year in. And you just stroke a check for 15 grand once out of the HELOC into that infinite banking policy. We do that, 2, 3, 4 years in a row. The whole while we're shredding our mortgage. And I would say usually most people within 4 years, maybe 5 at the outset, have no more mortgage payment, or we've recast the mortgage down to a much lower payment.
right.
So we could cut your mortgage payment in half. It means you have more discretionary income, more money going through Shred. And now you've got, let's say, 60 grand sitting in that infinite banking policy. Now someone who's in that situation says, I could go buy a multifamily property, or I could go drop, 25 or 50 grand in the market where I want to start playing. And so they do. From their infinite banking policy, they put it there. But they're still using Shred. They know how to use Shred. So now instead of shredding a mortgage, they're shredding their policy. So they keep filling the policy back up. And that policy bucket gets filled back up to 60 pretty quickly. And they're like, I can go do this again. And now they're doing that maybe twice a year, dropping 50 grand into something twice a year. And it's very similar to my grandparents used to ladder CDs. This is a thing people did. Every 6 months they'd buy a CD, or every 3 months they'd buy one, and then every 3 months it was coming due. This is kind of like laddering CDs. We're just starting to roll these investments into the next logical thing, with the end goal from our perspective of being to create cash flow, or what we like to call massive passive permanent streams of income.
Tax-free cash flow too.
Tax-free. Yep. That's exactly right.
Yeah, very interesting, Adam. Maybe we'll leave it there.
Yeah. We call it a 10-year freedom plan. We invite everyone to check it out. But I appreciate you letting me share my story, Cameron.
Of course, yeah. Like we'll put it in the show notes if anyone's interested in the shred method, interested in seeing that TED talk about financial abstraction as well. I think it was a very interesting topic. We'll leave that for people to find you.
Very cool. I appreciate it. Thanks again for having me.
Of course, Adam. Yeah, I really enjoyed having you on today.
Likewise.
All right.